about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
The geographical region now known as Iran has played an active role in the history of the Western world since ancient times. This relationship goes back to the societies of Bronze Age Mesopotamia, which groups like the Elamites and the Kassites either cooperated with or attacked. But beginning in the 6th century BCE, after the Sumerian, Assyrian, and Babylonian states had come to an end, a series of empires based in Iran dominated the region as far west as Asia Minor and as far east as India, challenging both classical Greece and the Roman world. The first of these was the Achaemenids, a Persian dynasty that began with Cyrus the Great. Cyrus took power from the Medes, who had recently defeated the Babylonian Empire and went on to conquer Asia Minor. His successors added Egypt and Central Asia to the new empire. This was the first time that all of these nations found themselves under the same foreign rule, and for the 200 years that the Achaemenid Empire lasted, it became famous for the variety of cultures and languages over which it presided, and the success with which it did so. Cyrus was known as the Mule because he came from a mixed Persian-Median family, a grandson of the Median king Astyages. In the year 559 BCE, he inherited the kingdom of Anshan in southeastern Iran, which made him his grandfather's vassal. After a few years, a war broke out between the two men, and Cyrus defeated Astyages to become the king of Media. He then set out to conquer the kingdoms of Asia Minor, starting with Lydia, which was ruled by Croesus, who was famous for his enormous wealth. Then, around 540 BCE, he defeated both the Elamites and the Babylonians, and along with Babylonia, he acquired all of its territories, including Syria, Palestine, and Arabia. He allowed the Jews, who had been exiled to Babylonia 50 years before, to return and rebuild Jerusalem and the Temple, for which the Bible describes him as God's anointed savior. Cyrus was followed by his son Cambyses, who invaded and occupied Egypt and stationed a garrison of Jewish soldiers on an island in the Nile. He also tried to extend his reach into eastern Africa, though it never became part of his empire. A new chapter in Achaemenid history began with the third king, Darius, who was not part of Cyrus's family but took power after the death of Cambyses. The activities of Darius and his successors are very well documented compared with those of the Mesopotamian and Hittite rulers, because we have both their own records in the form of inscriptions, clay tablets, and written correspondence, and descriptions of them in the Greek accounts of their wars with Persia in the 5th century BCE. By far the most important of these writers was Herodotus, who not only discussed the Persian kings of his time, but devoted a whole section of his book to describing the Persian Empire and how it functioned. Soon after Darius took power in 522 BCE, revolts broke out across Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, which he was able to suppress. Then, in 515, he conquered Central Asia, areas we would consider modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, as far as the Indus River Valley. In 513, he turned north and attacked the Scythian tribes who lived in Crimea, and he got as far as the Volga and Danube rivers in Eurasia. Darius then moved on to northern Greek states like Thrace and Macedonia, and in 490 BCE, he led an invasion of the Greek mainland. This was at least in part a response to a revolt against Persian rule that had broken out a few years before among the Greek cities of Ionia on the western coast of Asia Minor, as they had been helped by a contingent of Greeks from the city of Athens and its neighbor Eretria. Darius's invasion was thwarted by an alliance between Athens, Sparta, and several other Greek states. In the first years of his rule, Darius reorganized the empire, which under Cyrus and Cambyses did not have a well-developed central administration. He took as his models the Akkadian Empire of Sargon I, and especially the Neo-Assyrian Empire of the 10th to 7th centuries BCE, which was considered the most efficient state in the region. Darius began by dividing all of his territories into 20 provinces, each of which was under the control of a satrap. These satrapies were then divided into subunits. Satraps were assigned administrative, financial, and military officials, as well as a secretary who reported to the central government, and they were subject to inspections. Each satrap was responsible for paying the king a set amount of tribute, which was determined by the income and expenses of his particular province. The officials that ran the satrapies were either friends of the royal family or people they had chosen, as there was no system of government training or qualification. The labor required by these officials might be carried out by slaves, who were people that had been captured in war. The government kept track of both landed property, its value and its boundaries, and people, and its records were used to assess taxes and draft men for military service. These records were written on clay tablets in cuneiform and in the Elamite language, which along with other aspects of Elamite culture had been adopted by the Persians in the centuries before their empire was founded. Correspondence, on the other hand, was conducted in Aramaic, which had become commonly spoken throughout the region and was written in a convenient alphabet rather than in cumbersome cuneiform. We have Aramaic letters from this period written on leather, in which satraps give orders to their subordinates, question their activities and their efficiency, and warn them that they may be disciplined. The empire, which took advantage of whatever systems of government already existed in the regions it had conquered, was organized around 4 local capitals. These were Pasargadae, later Persepolis in Persia, Ecbatana in Media, Susa in Elam, and Babylon in Mesopotamia. Darius also improved trade and communication by building a system of roads, including the Royal Road that ran from Asia Minor through Mesopotamia and then joined with the Silk Road in Asia. He also created a new currency, one of the first in the Western world, which was called the daric. Though precious metal had already been used as a medium of exchange, having silver and gold coins of fixed and dependable weight, and therefore value, made transactions easier and allowed for the efficient collection of taxes, which were used in turn to finance construction projects. In Egypt, for example, Darius built canals between the Red Sea, the Nile, and the Mediterranean. The dedications carved on stone at these sites were written in several of the empire's languages, each one with its own variety of cuneiform. One of Darius's inscriptions, which commemorated his suppression of the revolts at the beginning of his reign, was used by 19th century historians to decipher cuneiform for the first time. When Darius died in 486 BCE, he was succeeded by his son Xerxes, who was immediately faced with rebellions in Babylon, and though he put an end to them, our Greek sources, which tend to demonize him, may exaggerate the brutality with which he did so. Then, in 480, Xerxes carried out a second invasion of Greece, which Darius had been planning before his death. Though our Greek sources tend to portray this war as a conflict between 2 irreconcilable forces, free Greeks of one language and culture defending their freedom against the masses of unfree peoples forced to fight by the Persian king, there were Greeks from a number of cities among the Persian forces. Though the invasion succeeded in destroying much of the city of Athens, it failed to leave a lasting presence, except in the sense that the Greeks' victory became an important part of their identity and their ideology. Like Darius, Xerxes promoted himself at home as a builder, and he completed work on the palaces his father had begun in the cities of Susa in Elam and Persepolis in Persia. During the earlier part of the 4th century BCE, the empire was relatively stable, and many projects were completed, including the temples that helped to spread Zoroastrianism, an Iranian religion that dated back to at least the 7th century BCE throughout the region. Later in the century, however, a series of revolts broke out in Egypt, on Cyprus, and on the Mediterranean coast, while a number of satraps rebelled against the central government over the course of 10 years, to the point that the armies of the western provinces were taken away from them so that they could not compound the problem. The Achaemenid Empire came to an end when its territories, from Asia Minor in the west to Central Asia in the east, were conquered by Alexander the Great in the 330s BCE. Alexander was planning to create a unified state when he died in 323, but after about 30 years of fighting among his generals who wanted to succeed him as king, his empire's territories were divided into 3 kingdoms. What had been the Persian homeland, as well as Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, wound up in the hands of Seleucus and his descendants. The provinces within this kingdom were governed, as before, by local satraps, and they continued, as before, to challenge the authority of the central government. Around 150 BCE, the Persian homeland in southwestern Iran became independent of Seleucid authority, and shortly after that it was absorbed into the Parthian kingdom in the northwest, which had broken away from the Seleucids in the 3rd century. This new kingdom, under Mithridates I, went on to conquer Media and then Mesopotamia, and became an important local power which developed relations with China to the east, with which it traded along the Silk Road, and with Rome to the west. But because of a lack of primary source material, the specifics of its political, economic, and social life are not as forthcoming as those of the empires that preceded and followed. Parthia and the late Roman Republic of the 1st century BCE came into conflict over the status of Armenia, which lay between them. Armenia had been an independent kingdom after breaking away from the Seleucids, and though it had been a close ally of the Parthians, it became a Roman client state at the beginning of the 1st century CE. Rome and Parthia also fought over Mesopotamia, and in 53 BCE, the Roman general Crassus suffered a serious defeat there, where he and much of his army were killed. Unlike the Roman army, the Parthian forces were centered around horses and archers, and they were famous for their ability to retreat on horseback while firing arrows to their rear. Fighting over Armenia continued into the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, with periodic flare-ups between the two states. The first of these began in 53 CE, when the Parthian king Vologases placed his brother Tiridates on the throne of Armenia, even though it had been agreed for the last 70 years that such decisions would be left to Rome. One of the Emperor Nero's generals was sent to negotiate with Tiridates, but in the end war broke out and Tiridates was forced from his throne. He was then replaced by Tigranes, who was the Romans' choice, but after Tigranes started attacking parts of Parthia, Vologases became directly involved in the war. In the end, neither side wanted to continue, so they agreed that Tiridates would return to the throne, but this time with Nero's blessing rather than Vologases. Another war broke out over Armenia in the early 2nd century CE, when the Emperor Trajan replaced the Parthian king himself with his own choice, and for 2 years his army occupied Mesopotamia. Armenia and Mesopotamia were also fought over in 164, 197, and 216. A few years later, however, a chief named Ardashir from southwest Iran, the same area the Achaemenids had come from, conquered that region and then defeated and supplanted the Parthian king. Ardashir's new empire, which is known as Sasanian or Neo-Persian, expanded until it contained almost all of the territories that had belonged to the Achaemenid kingdom, and it dealt some serious blows to the Roman army with battles in Mesopotamia and Syria. During most of the 4th century CE, it was ruled by Shapur II, who was more concerned with attacks from nomadic tribes, Arabs to the south and Huns to the north, than he was with the Roman Empire. In the centuries that followed, however, there was more and more conflict with the Byzantine Empire that emerged from the eastern half of the Roman Empire after it was split in two in the 4th century. The Sasanians, like the Parthians before them, had trade relations with China by way of the Silk Road, and they exerted a great deal of influence over northwestern India. They came to dominate trade in the Indian Ocean and Central Asia, and the central government, which exercised a lot of control over this trade, built roads and ports to facilitate it. The Sasanian state was organized into local districts, each with its own governors, and was run at the top by a number of noble families that included both Persians and Parthians. Below the king was a vizier, or prime minister, who was the chief administrator. There was also a lower level of administrators called azatan, who sometimes provided men for the cavalry. The Zoroastrian priesthood held a great deal of power at the time, and there is some debate about how much other religions were tolerated. Christians were sometimes persecuted, while Jews tended to be tolerated. In fact, it was during the Sasanian period that Babylonia became the intellectual center of the Jewish world, and produced the core of Talmudic literature. The Sasanians, like the Achaemenids, had a highly professionalized military, with cavalry units as well as archers, lancers, elephants, and siege engines. Its society was divided into castes: priests, warriors, artisans, and everyone else. Beginning with Ardashir, many new cities were built within the territory of the empire, which was organized around them, though it also contained many nomadic groups who did not fit within this system. The Sasanian system was a stable one, and power passed without conflict from one generation of the ruling family to the next. When it finally fell in the 7th century CE, it was only because Persia was conquered by Muslim armies from the south. But even then, the country's distinctive language and culture continued to flourish, as they still do today, while the other countries of the Middle East were being absorbed into an expanding Arabic society. With the ancient history of this region now understood, let's jump back in time once more to investigate ancient Egypt.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.